You're what now? Where exactly is this village then, Layla? Riddle me that. You're a Sumeru student, aren't you? Here's something that has been gnawing away at my brain. And no, it's not because I study at the academia. Where do all the characters live? Because while we have some that are very obvious and even accessible, there are other characters that, well, might be homeless. Now, yes, I know it isn't feasible to expect every location in an open world game. That would be insane. And I wouldn't know anything about being insane. You can see them too, right? But this is something I'm fixated on at the moment, so now I'm making it your problem too. We might as well do a deep dive, or a deep dig, since we're in Sumeru. So during Layla's hangout, we help her track down this mysterious legend of the Wisdom Sealy, and this is where we get our first mention of her home village, and that apparently it took her days to reach the city. We make our way to Mortimer Forest, to this spot right here, where she mentions her home once again, explaining that is the route she took to the city, with a cute little background story to boot. She was so nervous upon seeing the sight of the city that she accidentally stepped on an avidya leopard's tail. I'm sorry, again, what? Another thing Layla mentions that just doesn't exist in-game. The closest thing Sumeru has to this is a Rishboland tiger. No leopards. Guys, I think she's losing it from the lack of sleep. No, okay, but they actually do exist in lore because Tighnari also mentions them in his voiceovers, and considering they're called avidya leopards, that must mean they perhaps only live in avidya forest. But back to this supposed route and non-existent village. Well, I don't think it could be any of these abandoned villages because they're far too close to the city, and she mentions it took her days. And there are no other routes around this area other than through the mushroom forest. Following the road all the way takes us to its end here. Yep, it just stops. Sumeru is by far one of the largest offenders when it comes to having roads that don't road. Maybe Layla simply dreamt her village was real. On to the rest of the Sumeru characters to see how many of their homes have survived the withering and the city's arc-on awful planning, because the majority of the characters live in the city. Alhaitham and Kaveh have one of the most iconic homes in Teyvat located here, and it is possible to visit their home if you go to a certain part of Kaveh's hangout, and there are 2 doors, so they do both have rooms, as opposed to some other interiors that we've visited. Nahida and Wanderer both live at the sanctuary, which is obviously also accessible. Other members of the academia, Layla and Farazan, would have rooms there. Sino's home is very unclear. Sino is the general Mahamatra, so he might generally stay at the barracks. Nilu has a job at the theatre in the city, and if we look through her character story, it is actually mentioned where her family lives. She was born to an ordinary family from the downtown area, so I would assume around here, which again is in lore probably way bigger than what we see. Dori has the palace, but probably owns a lot of houses throughout Teyvat. We've seen where Tighnari and Kole live respectively over at Gandharvaville, although I question Tighnari's choice of giving Kole, you know, the person who had an illness, the house that is almost impossible to actually access. I'm inclined to put Dea down as homeless as she has no confirmed place and seems to be constantly on the move. Well, that or she lives with Danyazad, but we also don't know where she lives, so Candice on the other hand does live in Aru village, but we've never seen her house. We have access to a house in the village, but this is the chief's house. Unless we interpret this line from Unk here, he mentions she used to go to the wrong house due to her poor eyesight, as this meaning that she does live with them, and Cephos lives at the Temple of Silence here, the Dandelion Sea. Fact or fiction? Teyvatologists cannot seem to reach an agreement. It all stems from this book, The Fox in the Dandelion Sea, but there has so far been no proof of such a place, and most likely is just a children's fairy tale. Speaking of fictional places, turns out Mondstadt has quite a few of those. Wait, we can't make that joke anymore. Eula's family, for instance, the Lawrence clan, supposedly lives somewhere in Mondstadt. We just don't know where, as it doesn't exist in the world. Similarly, in Rosaria's backstory, it is revealed that she was born in a remote mountain village, at least until it was raided by bandits, and Rosaria was forced to fend for herself alongside them, before the knights intervened and defeated the bandits, giving Rosaria a chance to change her fate. And unless this village exists somewhere along unknown Mondstadt borders, it is unlikely the village will ever see the light of day. Albedo, while he has a campsite that he probably sleeps at sometimes, and an office at the Knights HQ, it's difficult to say where, if he has a residence, although Rhindotter's cat butler, Sebas, does mention that he cleans her house, and sort of implies that Albedo lives there. I think we can infer, for most characters that are members of the Knights, is that they likely live at the Knights HQ in some capacity, such as in barracks. So this would include Kaya, Klee, who has her own solitary confinement room, and you know, I don't think Alice would let her go homeless, Lisa, Sucrose, Noel, and now Varka too, since he's returned home. Mika would also count, but as his job kind of involves moving around constantly as a messenger, he probably doesn't have a set home. Amber is a bit trickier. Her character's story mentions her grandpa who raised her, and so presumably she lives there. However, my question is, because her grandpa disappeared, does she still live here? And how would she even afford a house on an outrider salary, which is probably very low? Mona, well, we all know where Mona lives, even though she somehow seems to never have enough Mora. Fischl's law states that she still lives with her parents, and we do in fact get to see her home during the second Gapelpelago, or at least a recreation of it. Bennett is a similar situation to Fischl in that he probably also lives with his dads. Razor, if we're gonna be technical, is homeless. He doesn't have a house, but instead lives in the wilds with his Lupical. We know which house Diona lives in Springvale, as she lives with her father Draff. Deluc? I'm not sure, it's hard to say. The two sisters live with their respective parents, Jean with Frederica and Barbara with Seamus Pegg. While I couldn't find any concrete proof, I think we can go out on a limb and assume that members of the church, so Rosaria and Dahlia, likely live there too, and that they have living quarters somewhere inaccessible. In Inazuma's case, did someone say case? We have to share our dreams with the Traveller and hope people's houses haven't been destroyed by Raiden's thunder. You know what's scarier than yokai? Ninjas. The Shumatsuban is a secret organization run by the Yashiro Commission. They work in the shadows to keep the people of Inazuma safe. The most up close we get to it is during the hidden quest line, the very special fortune slip, where the Fatui are attempting to infiltrate the ranks of the Shumatsuban, and we eventually help a member escape the Fatui. And of course, we all know Sayu. What is it with sleepy characters today? See, she more than likely resides in the Shumatsuban village. According to this random NPC in Komore Tea House, he mentions he also used to be a part of the Shumatsuban alongside Torumaru. What can't this dog do? But he mentions a ninja village. And that's literally it. The only info we have on this place. The Kamisato siblings, of course, live up in the mountains along the route to Narukami Shrine at the Kamisato estate, being one of the most important families in Inazuma and all that. Each commission in Inazuma has a location in-game, and Toma, being the housemaid, housekeeper, lives with the Kamisatos too. Within the city, there's Yoimiya. We know where she lives as we see it during the Archon quests. Heizo, I'm not so sure about. He works for the Tenryo Commission, and in his voiceovers, he specifically mentions eating at the police station, so he might be living here too. Mizuki owns the bathhouse, which also has rooms, so she likely lives here. Raiden has a giant castle, and Sara, being a member of the Kujo clan, lives over here at their residence. Shrine maidens all live at the shrine, so it's safe to say Miko does too. With Ito, the insinuation seems to be that he doesn't really have a permanent home. Kuki, when she was still a shrine maiden, would have lived at the shrine as well. However, now that she's a member of the Ito gang, I'm gonna have to put her down as homeless too, unfortunately. Karara never had a home when she was a kitten, and instead roamed the wilds until she joined human society. Even still, as her job entails traveling all over Teyvat, she doesn't seem to have a permanent home. While Kokomi has her office, I think the more likely place for her to be living is at the shrine. And finally, Goro, the other character from Watatsumi. Being the general of their army, I would wager he lives at the barracks like the rest of them. Next up are the Liyue characters. Question is, how many of their homes have eroded away? Baiju and Chi-Chi both live in the harbour at Bubu Pharmacy, and part of Baiju's place is even accessible. However, the rest of the building is not. And also there's the whole problem of this room doesn't even have a connection to the building. Ningguang, of course, has her jade chamber. Keqing, despite being one of the richest people in Liyue, has never once mentioned a home. Suspicious. Ganyu, despite supposedly living in the harbour too, we have no idea where. Chongyun comes from a family of exorcists, and in his mail has mentioned how he performs rituals with his family atop Mount Tianheng. Mostly he spends his time time traveling around. Lanyan lives in Chaoying Village, according to her character story. Much like the exorcists who dwell on Mount Tianheng, the Lan clan, with their affinity for the Qimen arts, have long made Chenyu Vale their home. So this all but confirms that the exorcists must have a home in the mountains of Tianheng, and we just don't see it. And in fact, this village is home to many artisans and craftspeople. Garming was also born in Chaoying Village. However, he moved out to pursue his passion of wushou dancing and planted himself in Yilong Wharf while working at the Sword and Strongbox Agency to keep himself afloat. Jing Cho. During 5.3's Lantern Rite, Hu Tao says, the Feiyun Commerce Guild is a large and prosperous family, with 4 generations living under one roof. And this event is also where we find out that the guild was founded in Yilong Wharf, and the old family home is here, meaning he used to live here, but perhaps the family now currently resides at Liuwa Harbor. Shenhe is also technically part of this family, and we even know where she grew up. First, this abandoned village on the outskirts of the harbor, before them being raised by Cloud Retainer up in the mountains. And there is the implication that she now lives in Liuwa Harbor and even works at Wanmin Restaurant, but again, no concrete evidence of where she resides in the city. And speaking of, no thanks, I'm just here to see if you have a house today. Zhang Ling, we know where she works, but where does she live? Because there isn't a house attached to this building. Perhaps she simply lives in a nearby one? Yao Yao has a similar backstory to other characters like Yula. According to her character story, she was born in the mountain wilds, with the closest settlement being Qingse village. But also, where could this possibly even be? Because the only spot near Qingse that isn't filled in at this point is that damn hole near Storm Terror's lair. Zhan Yun has an entire Adepti abode, so she is definitely not homeless. And Zhao lives at Wang Shuin. Yelan runs Yansheng Tea House, so could be living there. Xinyan's character story explicitly states that she has a house, and how Xinyan invited Yunjin, who is a fan of her work, over to her house, and that Yunjin was taken aback by how clean it was in contrast to Xinyan's persona. Yunjin herself, however, again, no mention of a home, although she is from a very wealthy family, so probably lives in a big house. Yanfei's lore doesn't seem to mention a home, but as a lawyer, she must be bringing in Mora. Beido's birthplace, despite being abandoned, does exist in the in-game world as this fishing village that was abandoned, but now she runs the Crux fleet, so I would imagine all crew members board here. Kazuha, as a part of the Crux, also travels with them, so he would have quarters on the ship too. Hu Tao's family business owns a building in Liuwa Harbor, but we aren't able to go inside. Perhaps this is also where she lives though? Plus, she also probably organizes boarding for Zhongli, because Archon knows he would not survive on his own. Zibai's home is a bit upside down. It's a miracle anyone in Fontaine still has a house after all those floods, but let's start with the easy ones. Nouvellette lives at the Palais Mammonia, and so did Farina until the events of the Archon quest, for which she now lives in an apartment in the city. We also see the apartment that Linny, Lynette and Fremine all live in. Risley and Siegewin, it's safe to say they live at the fortress, and Navia currently has 2 known homes that we've seen in game. She owns a place at Fleuve Sendra that we stay at one point, and then she owns the giant ship house over at Poisson, but I wouldn't doubt that she owns many other buildings throughout Fontaine with her influence. However, here is where things get a lot more tricky. Emily and Chiori, for instance, we know where their shops are, but there is no way they're living here as the buildings are way too small, but they must be living in the city somewhere. Same goes for Charlotte, although she travels a lot so would rarely be staying there. Chevrus, as a member of the Maison Gardiennage, presumably bases herself at a barracks. I think it's safe to say Clorinde also lives somewhere in the city. And last but not least, Escoffier, who, for all her fame and glory, actually doesn't seem to have a home. Her lore mentions that she's pretty much always traveling to discover new things, and at the end of her story quest said she was working with Zhang Ling. However, she can also be found in Nodcry looking for Aino and Ineffa's crumb kake recipe, so she never stays in one place for too long. Natlan's characters' homes seem to have survived the Abyss invasion because we know where most of them live. Sitlali's home is even accessible after completing her story quest, where she gives you the keys to her place. However, then we have Auroron, who is shown to have a farm and a home, but we don't actually know where exactly this is. Julianen, of course, lives here next to her smithy, while Kachina, it's not clear exactly which house is hers. Mualani is from the People of the Springs, and her shop is located here, so I think it's safe to say this part is her house. Kinich is gonna have to go down as homeless because there's never any mention of where his home is. And as for Mavawika, well, during the Archon Dragon Quest, we get to see her office, so it's likely that she does live at the stadium. Over at the Flower Feather clan is Aoife, and we actually do know where he lives. Looks kind of small though, must be a pocket dimension or something. But for Chaska, we never get to see her home. Same goes for Ian-san. We also don't know whereabouts in the Collective of Plenty that she lives. Veressa, on the other hand, we do know where her home is. We see it during her story quest. And last but not least, are the Nod Cry characters. Do not cry, because they all have homes. Well, kind of. So I know that you know where Aino and Anetha's house is. Nefer and Yehoda live at the Curatorium of Secrets in Nasha Town, and again, it's somewhat accessible, although we can't see their rooms. Lauma lives at the Frostmoon Scions, and while they don't really have buildings, they probably set up tents around the area to sleep in. We know that Flynn's lives at the lighthouse. Columbina's home is, I guess Silvermoon Hall is the closest thing she has to one. Well, she's probably also built a house on the moon. Itluja has a house at Pyramida. Nicole has a house nearby too that even has a questline centered around it. And last but not least, Prune is actually originally from Nod Cry, and her character story mentions her parents and her home, which would likely be in Nasha Town. Well, I guess it's time for me to decorate my own home. Oh.